Charles Barkley is a funny guy. He says a lot that just cracks me up. But sometimes he goes a little bit too far. And then he just completely loses me. Says things that are completely nonsensical. One of the recent things that he said that just didn't make a whole lot of sense is when he said some guys are bus drivers while others are bus riders. He called himself and guys like Shaq bus drivers. And this is where it gets interesting, is he called someone like KD a bus rider. And of course, you can imagine that turned into a whole drama. A whole lot of people had a whole lot to say about that. But more importantly, you can imagine that KD himself, the guy who is known for having burner accounts, had something to say. And of course, this thing about him being a bus rider was in reference to his time in Golden State. It was saying, yeah, sure, he might have been a bus driver when he was at OKC, but when he was with the Golden State Warriors, he was for sure a bus rider. This is what Chuck says. And you can imagine that for KD, that was not going to go unchallenged. And of course, he said something. One of the things he said was, well, let's point out your time with the Rockets. Let's point out your time with the Sixers when, according to this analogy of yours, you were a bus rider. And it got quite funny. And really for me, the funny thing is all of this was precipitated by this whole drama with the Nets getting swept by the Celtics. Of course, you can imagine that there's a whole lot of talk about how KD, when he's on his own, when he doesn't have Steph, can't seem to get over the hump and lead a team to a championship. But man, I've got a couple of issues with this whole idea of a bus driver versus a bus rider. And of course, as you've already heard, KD has his own issues with that. But yeah, it caught KD at a time when I imagine he was feeling pretty down about what happened with the Nets and them getting swept. But yeah, as I was saying, Chuck is a pretty funny guy. And the strange thing about this whole analogy is that it wasn't serious. It came from a funny place. And it suddenly took a life of its own. It took on a life of its own when it had initially started as a joke. And then it turned into a thing. And that actually, for me, I think also where it came from is not this beef. I wouldn't say it's a beef between Kenny and Chuck, but I would just say that there's this needling that's been going on between the two of them, where Kenny is constantly throwing these little shots at Chuck, and they seem harmless. They seem like jokes, where he's constantly teasing Chuck about not winning a championship. So I think this whole bus rider analogy, bus driver analogy thing also came from that. It was a way to get at Kenny, and of course it definitely worked. He tried his absolute best to respond and even be nice, calling Chuck a champion, saying, yes, you didn't win a championship, but you're a champion, because he was trying to diffuse this whole thing, and it definitely got under his skin. You could see. And I think on some level it's his fault, because he kept on going on about the championships that he won with the Rockets. And I can also understand why Chuck would have that mentality of bus drivers versus bus riders, because if we go according to that analogy, when he was with the Suns, he was definitely a bus driver, because he was pretty much MVP caliber. He was a superstar, and we all know the battles that he fought against Michael Jordan, who, again, according to this analogy, would have been a bus driver as well. For me, this whole analogy is flawed. It disregards various teammates. It poses more questions than it answers. If you look at KD's time at Golden State, Are you telling me that there's no other way, no better way of looking at his time there than to say, he was just a bus rider, that someone else was the bus driver? And okay, if we run with that, who was the bus driver? Was it Draymond? Was it Steph? Who was the bus driver? It's very difficult to use this analogy without disregarding someone. There's absolutely no ways that the Golden State Warriors would have won the championship they won in 2015 without Draymond, without guys like Harrison Barnes, without Klay Thompson. What about Klay Thompson? Was he just a passenger? The whole notion of a passenger is you're just sitting at the back, you're not giving directions, as Kenny was saying, you're just sitting there and you're waiting to press a button when it's your stop to get out, or however the system works on that particular bus. The whole point is you're just sitting there waiting to get to where you're getting to. But KD was instrumental, and so was Klay and all these other guys. So it's just very difficult to talk about bus riders and bus drivers without disrespecting guys like Draymond. And the other problem is players are human beings. Players are vulnerable sometimes. And yeah, in sport you need to be tough, you need to not to have a thick skin, to not be easily affected by stuff. But as we've seen, mental health is real. And talking about guys being bus riders as opposed to bus drivers, we can already see that with guys like Ben Simmons, talk like that affects them. It renders them incapable of playing, of suiting up. And then when they don't suit up, when they sit on the sidelines, they get called more names, and more things, more disparaging things get said about them and their times in various teams. I mean, one way of looking at it is to use the analogy of pilots to talk about co-pilots. If I had to describe what Steph, KD, Draymond, and Klay were doing with the Golden State Warriors, I'd talk about how Steph was pretty much the captain, and then you had the first pilot, you had the engineer, and then you have the other people, the crew, who are involved in it. So that's kind of how I would describe it. And even that is not a perfect analogy, but it's a better analogy in the sense that it's not all on the bus driver. I get Chuck's larger point about pressure, the fact that when you are the captain of this plane, you're expected to provide that leadership, and ultimately accountability rests with you. The ultimate pressure rests with you to bring it home, to bring home the championship. But just disregarding these other guys is also kind of stupid and nonsensical on some level. But you know what? All in all, I love Chuck. I think he's hilarious. My appreciation of Inside the NBA is at an all-time high. I watch it pretty much every time a game is on TNT, so I'm going to keep watching. I find them hilarious, but it's good to just call it out every now and again, to call out their bullshit.